Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something a lot of you have been asking about, dialectical behavior therapy.
DBT.
DBT, yeah, and how it impacts self-harm, specifically for women with borderline personality disorder.
Right.
And to help us really dig into this, we've got an awesome literature review that breaks down a ton of research on DBT's effectiveness.
Yeah, this is such a crucial area to explore. BPD and self-harm are unfortunately way more common than a lot of people realize.
For sure.
And understanding the potential treatments is just so important.
Absolutely. So let's start by painting a picture for everyone just how big of an issue this is.
Okay, so BPD itself affects something like 1 in 100 people.
Wow.
And it tends to be diagnosed more often in women for a variety of reasons.
Okay.
And what's really concerning is that within that group, like a staggering 80% engage in self-harm.
80%.
Yeah.
That's a huge number. I mean, that really highlights the need to find, effective ways to help it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at data from the UK's Health and Social Care Information Centre, back in 2012 and 2013 alone, there were over 225,000 emergency room visits in England just for self-harm.
Wow.
And over half of those visits were women who are already receiving mental health services.
It's clearly not just an isolated thing,
No.
The literature review actually goes into some really compelling arguments about the link between, social inequalities and mental health and self-harm,
Right.
suggesting that it's not just a personal struggle, but also really connected to, these broader societal factors.
Yeah, definitely. And researchers like Kaplan have highlighted how certain societal views can actually end up blaming women who are victims of abuse.
Oh, wow.
So instead of focusing on the, abuser's actions, the focus
Yeah.
kind of shifts to this question of why doesn't the woman just leave?
Right.
And this leads to this, internalized blame and self-harm as like a coping mechanism
Yeah, exactly.
for those feelings.
So it's a super complex issue with, all these layers of social and personal challenges just kind of all mixed together.
Definitely.
So then how does DBT fit into all of this?
Well, so DBT was actually developed specifically for BPD by Dr. Marsha Linehan.
Huh?
And at its core, it aims to address emotional dysregulation.
Okay.
So many individuals with BPD struggle to understand and manage their emotions. They experience them very intensely, which can lead to those impulsive behaviors like self-harm.
Okay.
So DBT provides a framework to kind of help them regulate those emotions,
Hmm.
offering practical coping skills and validating their experiences to help them feel heard and understood.
One of the things that I found really interesting in the research was Linehan's concept of the invalidating environment, or TIE.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So the tie concept basically suggests that if someone grows up in an environment where their emotions are constantly dismissed or invalidated,
Right.
especially by, close family or caregivers, it can lead to problems with emotional regulation later on in life.
I see.
So imagine a child constantly being told to toughen up,
Right.
or that their feelings are wrong.
Yeah.
That can have a real impact.
So essentially, TIE kind of sets the stage for self-harm to become a way of coping with those intense, unvalidated emotions.
Exactly. It's a really difficult cycle that DBT aims to interrupt.
Now, I found it really interesting that there's some debate around whether DBT is a preventative measure, a treatment, or even a health promotion tool.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It gets to the heart of how we view DBT.
Right.
So some researchers see it as this preventative strategy, equipping people with these emotional regulation skills before self-harm even begins.
Okay.
Others see it as a treatment for those already engaging in self-harm.
Right.
There's even an argument to be made that it fits into a health promotion framework,
Okay.
empowering individuals to improve their overall well-being.
Got it.
If you analyze it using BD's model of health promotion, it seems to align most closely with personal counseling.
Okay, that's a helpful way to frame it.
Yeah.
So with all that said, what does the research actually tell us about DBT's effectiveness in reducing self-harm?
Well, there's a wealth of research out there on DBT, but as with many complex issues, the findings aren't always clear-cut.
Okay.
To really understand the nuances, we need to dive into some of the key studies highlighted in this literature review.
Perfect. Let's do that. Let's unpack these studies and see what they reveal.
Okay.
Where should we start?
Well, one study that caught my eye was by James and colleagues back in 2008.
Okay.
They looked at adolescent girls in a community setting
Okay.
and found that DBT led to a pretty significant decrease in self-harm.
Okay, that's encouraging. But you mentioned earlier that, the findings aren't always totally straightforward.
Right.
What makes this particular study stand out, or are there limitations we should be thinking about?
It's a good starting point for sure, but it's important to remember that this study focused specifically on teenage girls
Okay.
in a community setting. And even the researchers themselves acknowledge that, more research is needed to see if those same results hold up in different settings like hospitals or inpatient programs.
So the location and like the patient's age could play a role.
Yeah, definitely.
Did other studies look at DBT in those different contexts?
They did. There's a 2014 study by Fox and colleagues that examined DBT's impact in a low-security hospital setting.
Okay.
They looked at adult women with BPD over a year,
Okay.
and they also found a significant reduction in self-harm,
Interesting.
particularly within the first 6 months.
So we're seeing like positive results across different age groups and settings.
Right.
But I'm guessing those inconsistencies you mentioned start to come into play when we look closer at like the study designs.
You got it. For example, the James study relied pretty heavily on self-reporting from the participants,
Okay.
which can sometimes be, less reliable.
Right.
The Fox study, on the other hand, benefited from being able to observe participants in a more controlled environment. So those variations in methodology can definitely influence the outcomes.
So how the researchers actually measured self-harm, that could factor into the results.
Absolutely.
Were there other big differences in how these studies were structured?
For sure, take the 2001 study by Lowe and colleagues.
Okay.
It was conducted in a UK high-security hospital, and they measured self-harm rates every 3 months over a year and a half.
Okay.
They used a really comprehensive set of assessments to track progress.
Okay.
And while they initially saw an 80% reduction in self-harm,
Wow.
there was a bit of a rebound effect after treatment ended.
So like the timing of those measurements and the specific tools they used to track progress
Right.
could also be contributing to these, inconsistencies we're seeing across the research.
Exactly.
It seems like there are a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah.
Are there any other studies from the literature review that we should talk about?
Yeah, 2 more that are worth mentioning are the McMain study from 2009 and the Verhoeven study from 2003. Both of those were randomized controlled trials,
Okay.
which are, considered the gold standard in research
Right.
because they randomly assign participants to different treatment groups,
Okay.
which helps minimize bias and really isolate the effects of the treatment.
Okay.
But even with that super rigorous design, these studies still had their limitations.
Okay. I'm curious, what did McMain's team find?
So their study compared DBT to general psychiatric management for women with BPD.
Okay.
And surprisingly, they found no significant difference in self-harm reduction between the two groups.
Oh, wow.
So both approaches seem to help, which suggests that having a well-defined treatment plan, even if it's not DBT specifically, can be beneficial.
That's a really significant finding. I mean, it suggests that DBT might not be the only path to positive outcomes.
Right. It does. But it's important to note that this particular study excluded participants with other co-occurring conditions,
Okay.
which are really common with BPD. So we have to be cautious about applying these findings to, the broader population of women with BPD.
Got it. So the study sample might not fully reflect the complexities of real-world cases?
Exactly.
What about the Verhoeven study? What were the key takeaways there?
So Verhoeven and colleagues compared DBT to what they call treatment as usual,
Okay.
which differed from the general psychiatric management in the McMain study.
Gotcha.
They tracked self-harm incidents very carefully and found that DBT led to more substantial reductions compared to the less structured treatment as usual approach.
Okay, so it seems like the type of treatment used as a comparison point
Right.
can really impact how we interpret DBT's effectiveness.
Yeah,
This is fascinating, but I have to admit, it's a lot to process.
it is.
It does seem like I'm starting to grasp, the nuances of these research findings.
Yeah, definitely. It highlights the complexity of this topic.
For sure.
And remember, the goal isn't to overwhelm you with information, but to really help you navigate these research findings and draw your own conclusions about DBT.
That's a helpful reminder. Speaking of complexity, one recurring theme I noticed was the high dropout rate from DBT programs
Yeah.
across a lot of these studies. Why do you think that is?
That's an important observation. DBT does require a significant commitment from participants.
Okay.
It involves individual therapy group skills,
Yeah.
training, phone coaching. It can be pretty intensive.
Right.
It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach.
So is it a case of some people just not being well suited for this type of therapy, or are there other factors at play?
It's more nuanced than that. Some research suggests that the environment where DBT is provided can impact dropout rates.
Okay.
Imagine the differences in challenges and stressors between someone receiving therapy in a high-security setting versus a community setting.
Of course, their external circumstances would totally impact their ability to engage with the therapy.
Exact.
Are there other things that might contribute to these dropout rates?
Absolutely. Researchers think that therapists' attitudes towards BPD and self-harm can influence patient engagement and compliance. So if a therapist isn't fully on board with DBT or they lack adequate training, it could create barriers for the patient.
Makes sense. I mean, the therapist's, buy-in and expertise would totally impact the patient's experience or
Yes.
willingness to continue.
Right.
It seems like the human element from both the patient and the therapist's perspective
Yeah.
is a really crucial factor in DBT's effectiveness.
Definitely. And that brings us to another critical question.
Okay.
Even if DBT proves to be effective, is it cost effective?
Yes. The question of practicality and resources.
Right.
Let's explore that. Yeah, that's a really important thing to think about, right? I mean, DBT is known for being pretty resource intensive.
Uh-huh.
It needs specialized training for therapists, and it often involves, these really lengthy programs.
Right.
Does the research give us any insights into, whether DBT is economically viable?
And that's where it gets kind of tricky.
Okay.
There have been studies looking at the cost effectiveness of DBT,
Right.
but the results are, as you might expect, kind of mixed. Some suggest that it can actually lead to cost savings in the long run.
Yeah.
For example, Wagner and colleagues found that people in DBT had a 50% reduction in healthcare costs compared to the year before they started therapy.
Wow. That seems like a strong argument, in favor of DBT being cost effective.
Yeah.
I mean, reducing healthcare costs by half is pretty significant.
It's definitely promising, but other studies haven't found such dramatic cost savings.
Okay.
Amner's 2012 study in the UK
Okay.
found that DBT did result in some cost savings.
Okay.
But it was around £36,000 over a 3-year period,
Okay.
which, might not seem as substantial when you weigh it against that initial investment.
So the economic picture is still a bit unclear.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway when it comes to DBT and cost effectiveness?
I think the main point is that we need more research,
Okay.
particularly studies using standardized models to compare costs and benefits across different settings and populations.
Makes sense.
It's really crucial to have, consistent measures so we can really compare apples to apples.
I like that analogy.
Yeah,
So it seems like there's still a lot to learn about the long-term economic impact of DBT.
for sure.
As we wrap up our deep dive today, what were some of the key recommendations for future research that came out of this literature review?
Well, several things stood out to me.
Yeah.
First, we need studies with longer follow-up periods.
Okay.
A lot of the existing studies only track participants for a year or two.
Right.
To really understand the impact of DBT, we need to see how the benefits hold up over a much longer time.
So we need a better sense of how people do once they're back in their everyday lives,
Exactly.
dealing with things outside of that structured therapy setting.
Right. And another important area for future research is looking at the impact of those social determinants of health that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
How do things like poverty or discrimination or lack of access to resources affect how well DBT works?
That's a really good point. I mean, it's
Right.
not just about the therapy itself, right?
Right.
It's about how it works within the context of someone's actual life.
Exactly. And lastly, we need more standardized frameworks for actually measuring DBT's effectiveness.
Okay.
That would allow for more accurate comparisons between all these different studies.
Right.
And help us draw, more solid conclusions.
It makes it hard to get a clear picture when everyone's using different tools and measurements.
Absolutely.
So it seems like the overall message here is that while DBT shows a lot of promise in helping women with BPD who struggle with self-harm, there's still a lot more to learn and a lot more to research.
Definitely.
Any final thoughts for our listeners today?
Yeah, I think it's really important to leave everyone with this question.
Yeah.
How can we make sure that everyone has access to effective mental health treatments like DBT?
That's a really important question.
We need to think about those social and economic factors that we talked about that play such a huge role in people's lives.
Absolutely.
It's not just about developing these therapies,
Right.
but about making sure that they're available to everyone who needs them.
That's such an important point to end on. And for our listeners who want to dive even deeper into this topic, I definitely recommend checking out the book we've been talking about today, The Effectiveness of DBT in Reducing Self-Harm Among Women with BPD. You can find it on Amazon, and we've included a link in the episode description. And of course, a huge thank you to everyone who supports our work here at The Deep Dive. If you'd like to help us keep bringing you these insightful deep dives, you can find a donation link in the episode description as well. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration.